Who do you watch in the Big Ten? Well, we know who you watch in the Big Ten, but it's still fun to look at the numbers. Welcome to the Voice of College Football. We break it down with you each and every day. Best discussion, debate, and analysis. Please subscribe. Get us to 100,000 subs because it benefits you with better content. All right, let's look at it in the Big Ten. We continue our TV rating series for 2022 as we break it down, not just present the numbers. Again, put it into context, make the comparisons, and let you know why people are watching your team or not watching your team or conference or your particular network. That's what it all comes down to. Comes down to the network, the team, the popularity of the matchup, of course. All right, let's look at the Big Ten. And again, check out the rest of the series. We've had fun with this one, and we've got all sorts of great series coming your way. May is great debate month right here at the Voice of College Football. Leave us your request for a great debate in college football. Also, we've got power rankings coming up post-spring, as well as position units and player ratings right here at the Voice of College Football. And, of course, our program rankings and our revised national championship list of all time. All right, let's get to this and the TV ratings in the Big Ten. Let's start with Illinois. Well, the Illini had its best season since going to the Rose Bowl under Ron Zook in 2007. But nobody watched him play early in the season, except that decent showing with almost 1 million viewers against Indiana on a Friday night on FS1, a game that went right down to the wire. A lot of games on Big Ten Network for Illinois, and we're going to see this as a common trend. The Big Ten Network shows the worst teams. They get the scraps of the Big Ten as the best games go to Fox and ABC. When Illinois did show up on ABC, they had two great viewership totals against Nebraska, despite Nebraska being down at 2.5 million views on ABC, and then also against Michigan late in the season, a game that went down to the final play at over 5 million views there. When we total it all up, we know that we can see that Illinois appeared on the Big Ten Network 7 times, ABC twice, and then ESPN2 once, ESPNU once, and FS1 one time for the Illini. When we add it all up, just under 14 million people watched regular season games with Illinois football. Over 2 million watched the ReliaQuest Bowl that went down to the final play of the game as well against Mississippi State on ESPN2. Northwestern was not just the worst team in the Big Ten. They were the worst team in college football in the Power 5. I don't think it's debatable. 1-11. And they lost to a MAC team. They lost to an FCS team. However, they can say something that nobody in the Pac-12 can say. They had 2 games with over 4 million viewers. They actually had a game that had more views than any in the Pac-12 all season. Let's check out the Wildcats. They took on Nebraska on Fox in Week 0, and of course a ton of people watched that game. There was no other college football on. Then hardly anybody watched them play against Duke and Southern Illinois the next 2 weeks on FS1 and the Big Ten Network, and also Miami of Ohio, a loss for Northwestern on the Big Ten Network. There, one other game besides the Ohio State game that went over 1 million views was the Penn State game on ABC. Not surprisingly, when they took on Ohio State late in the season, almost 5 million people watched as the Buckeyes struggled against the Wildcats for much of that game, and it was in doubt into the fourth quarter, and that by far the game that most people watched after the Ireland game. So we're talking about a game where there was college football competition on at noon, but still people were watching Ohio State and Northwestern. As we see, nobody watching the Wildcats most of the season. Dismal performances in terms of ratings, even by Big Ten Network standards that usually get close to 1 million views. When Northwestern's on, it's in the 400,000 range. 6 games on BTN, 2 on ABC, Penn State and Ohio State. ESPN2 once, Fox once, and FS1 twice for Northwestern football, as the Wildcats had 13.15 million viewers throughout the season. Nebraska's been a bad football team for 5 or 6 years. They still are until proven otherwise, but Husker Nation still shows up. They show up at the stadium. They show up in front of their TV sets, and they showed up, of course, when the Huskers took on the Wildcats in Ireland to start the season, one of the highest rated games on Fox all season. Of course, no competition. Then the Huskers folded after that, and they lost games, but not necessarily viewers. A Big Ten Network game of nearly 1 million views against North Dakota. That's a good showing. Georgia Southern on FS1, over 1.2 million people watched that. The Oklahoma game on Fox was the second highest rated game of the week, and then decent showings on the Big Ten Network and against Rutgers on a Friday night on FS1. On through the season, we see peak performances, at least in terms of television ratings, against Illinois on ABC and at Michigan, despite that being a ho-hum effort by both teams, a boring, sluggish kind of game, but still almost 4 million people watched it on ABC. As again, Nebraska football topped the 1 million mark. Now compare that to Northwestern and Illinois, the two teams we just reviewed. Nebraska, well over the million mark. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 out of 12 games. They were on the Big Ten Network 4 times, ABC twice, Fox twice, FS1 twice, and one each on ESPN against Wisconsin and also on ESPN2. That game was against Minnesota with over 1 million views. In total, Nebraska games for the 12 that they played in the regular season, 23.7 million people watched it. Let's compare that to the Golden Gophers of Minnesota, a much better football team at 8-4 in the regular season with a bowl win. But less people watched the Gophers. They had 6 games on the Big Ten Network. Look at those early showings against New Mexico State, Western Illinois, Colorado on ESPN2. Then they were back in play on the Big Ten Network against Michigan State, a game that they won and played in front of over 1 million people on television. The ESPN2 game against Purdue was a big game in the Big Ten Western Division, but less than 1 million people watched it, which is actually a pretty regular showing on ESPN2. Later in the season, it was as we get to the Penn State game, over 3.5 million people watched that. That is the high water mark for Minnesota football. So if you run into Ohio State and Michigan on the schedule, then that's going to be your highest rated game of the year. And then thirdly, it's going to be Penn State. That holds out throughout the conference schedule. Late in the season, Minnesota played a key game against Iowa on Fox. Again, the network plays into this heavily, and 2.5 million people watched that game. Minnesota at Wisconsin on ESPN with 1.71 million views. And then against Syracuse, a bowl game that attracted almost 3 million viewers, 2.75 against Syracuse, again on the Pinstripe Bowl. Minnesota appeared on the Big Ten Network 6 times, ABC once, ESPN once. That was the Wisconsin game. ESPN2 3 times, which is a lot for a Big Ten team. The Colorado, Purdue, and Nebraska games on ESPN2, and only 1 Fox appearance for PJ Fleck and company. If you love offensive football, of course, don't watch Iowa, but still the Hawkeye faithful showed up to the TV sets to watch their Hawkeyes, the 7th most watched team in the Big Ten. Let's look at the numbers. South Dakota, the infamous 7-3 game with no touchdowns, was watched by 1 million people on FS1. And then the Hawkeyes and the Cyclones got together on the Big Ten Network with about 390,000 viewers. We had to split that number because of a regional game showing by the Big Ten Network that week. And then we see the Nevada game that was delayed for about 3 hours. So not a good start for Iowa viewership. Then they kicked it into gear against the likes of Michigan on Fox, noon game, over 4 million viewers. The Illinois game was a huge game, watched by just 855,000 on FS1. However, then Ohio State, noon game, Fox, there you go, 4 million plus watched it, and then back down into the low viewership category with about 1/10 of that audience watching the Hawkeyes take on Northwestern the next week. And then near the end of the season, big games against Minnesota and Nebraska watched by 2.5 million and almost 1.5 million on the Big Ten Network against the Huskers to conclude the season. Kentucky and Iowa matched up for a second consecutive year in a bowl game on ABC, and 3 million watched the Hawkeyes and the Wildcats. All told, Iowa appeared on the Big Ten Network 3 times, ESPN2 once, but most of their games on the Fox networks. The Fox networks love the Hawkeyes. 3 on Fox, 5 on FS1. Very similar team, very similar program, very similar results out of Wisconsin. Early in the season, they had a big game on Fox against Washington State. Not necessarily a marquee matchup or a sterling kind of matchup, but almost 4 million people watched the Cougars and the Badgers in Madison. There you see ABC, Ohio State. That's always a ratings winner, and especially in prime time. Well, actually not especially in prime time. Whenever they play on ABC, it doesn't really matter. It's Wisconsin, Ohio State, and even though the game was over at the end of the first quarter, almost 5 million people watched the Buckeyes and the Badgers. Then you see some fairly dismal showings. Illinois that only 573,000 people watched that game. The next week against Northwestern, similar showing. Then they go on Fox against Michigan State, and boom, 2.5 million people watch. Two marginal teams in the Spartans and the Badgers. We go through the rest of the season, and we see the Badgers clear 1 million viewers against Purdue, Iowa, Nebraska, and Minnesota to conclude the season. Then they march into postseason play and take on Oklahoma State on ESPN with 2.56 million viewers. All told, Wisconsin on the Big Ten Network 4 times, ABC once, ESPN twice. Those games against Minnesota and Purdue, ESPN 2 once, 2 Fox games, 2 FS1 games for Wisconsin at over 19 million views, just about 1 million more for a 12-game regular season than Iowa. It was a topsy-turvy season in the Big Ten Western Division, and Purdue outlasted everyone to make it to Indianapolis. But did people watch the journey? Yes, they did against Penn State in the opener on a Thursday night. So, of course, that aided by only one other game on that night, West Virginia and Pitt on ESPN. 3.5 million people watched the Boilers and the Nittany Lions. And, of course, nobody's going to watch Purdue and Indiana State. Then they're back on ESPN2 in Week 3 with over 1 million views, and it was a great fourth quarter. Back to nobody watching on the Big Ten Network the next week. All right, into conference play. How many times did Purdue clear 1 million views? Well, they did against Wisconsin on ESPN, barely. And then that was it for the regular season. Nobody's watching Purdue's run to the Big Ten Championship. The best showings, other than that Wisconsin game on the road on ESPN, the Nebraska game on the Big Ten Network, almost 1 million views, and then close to 1 million views when they took on Illinois in a key game on ESPN2, 835K. The Big Ten Championship game featured Michigan and Purdue with almost 11 million views. That was the second highest rated conference championship game. And then, of course, Purdue wanted less people to watch them lose by 8 touchdowns against LSU, 63-7 on ABC, but it was 3.3 million people watched Purdue's annihilation. Purdue was the second least watched team in the Big Ten this year, 10.4 million viewers. Actually, more people watched them in the postseason. More people watched the Big Ten Championship game with Purdue and Michigan than watched the entire Purdue 12-game season by 300,000 views. Then, of course, the bowl game tacked on was by far more than anybody watched, except for the Penn State opener. There is the Purdue results with 5 games on the Big Ten Network, once on ESPN, 3 times on ESPN2, once on Fox, and then on FS1 twice in those games against Iowa and Northwestern. Rutgers was supposed to bring eyeballs to the Big Ten. That's why the Big Ten went and got Rutgers. It wasn't because of their football prowess, that's for sure, but it was because they were going to bring the New York television market, right? Did Rutgers bring the television market in New York City? Let's look at the numbers. It's a big resounding no. We've got no numbers for the Boston College game on the ACC network, but I'm guessing about 50,000 people watched that game. And then Rutgers had a Big Ten Network game against Wagner. I am shocked 380,000 people consider that worthy of their attention. Then Rutgers played Temple, and this is the only game in the entire conference, the entire season. And we're talking about games against FCS teams and the like that nobody wanted to air the game. It was on ESPN Digital, ESPN Plus against Temple, so no numbers for that. Then after that, okay, against Iowa and FS1, 700,000 people watched the game. Okay, Rutgers did participate in the most watched game on the Big Ten Network the entire season. But I kind of think that's because Ohio State was involved. 1.79 million watched Ohio State and Rutgers on the Big Ten Network. Later in the season, Rutgers had 1.3 million views against Michigan on the Big Ten Network. I think we can follow a pattern there. It's called Ohio State and Michigan. Against Nebraska, that was a Friday night game, so nobody else is watching college football anywhere else, so they're locked on to FS1, and that got over 1 million views, but that was it for Rutgers football, capped off by a dismal showing of only 97,000 people watching Maryland and Rutgers on the Big Ten Network at noon on the final weekend of the season. Of course, that was against Ohio State and Michigan and other rivalry games. All told, we told you at the beginning that the Big Ten Network showed the worst teams and the worst matchups. Of course, that only makes sense. And yes, Rutgers 8 times on the Big Ten Network. Almost their entire conference schedule was on the Big Ten Network, the ACC Network once. FS1 picked up Rutgers twice. Maryland keeps getting better. Sub 500 to 7-6 to 8-5. How did they fare in terms of you watching them? Well, they started off with Buffalo on the Big Ten Network. Nobody watched the game. Then they took on Charlotte. This is the only game other than the Rutgers situation where we've got no viewership on the Charlotte game and no TV listed. SMU, that was a really good ball game against SMU on FS1. Spit that out 3 times fast. 257,000 watched Maryland and SMU. Okay, then some people started to see the Terps play some football. They went to Michigan, good ball game into the fourth quarter. 4.5 million people watched it. Then against Michigan State, Purdue, the Purdue-Maryland game. Nobody watched the game, but I'm telling you, I watched it. It was a really good game, went down to the wire, and was key for Purdue winning the Big Ten Western Division, but 400,000 views. At Indiana the next week, almost as many people watched that game on ESPN2. A lot of Big Ten Network games for Maryland. Then down the stretch of the season, they got a little viewership against Penn State, of course, and then against Ohio State, of course. Bam, all of a sudden people were watching Maryland football. 6.6 million against Ohio State on ABC, and then back to nobody watching Maryland the next week against Rutgers. They showed up in a bowl game against North Carolina State, and in addition to everyone chowing down Duke's mayo, they watched the Wolfpack and the Terps at 2.68 million. All told, almost 16 million people watched Maryland football over the course of the 12 regular season games. Almost 19 million people watched them after the bowl game. Big Ten Network 5 times, 1 appearance on ABC. That was a huge one, of course, against Ohio State. ESPN2 once, Fox twice, and FS1 twice for the Terps. After winning the Peach Bowl 11 games and finishing in the top 10, a down season for Michigan State and Mel Tucker, and let's see how it affected them in TV ratings. Opening on ESPN on a Friday night with 1.35 million against Western Michigan. That's a good showing, but again, that's basically the only college football going on at that time. Nobody watched the Akron game. Then they took on Washington on ABC in primetime, 2.8 million views, which is actually not a great showing for primetime, but it is ABC, so people are watching that network. Then we get into the Big Ten play, and on the Big Ten Network, Michigan State was blasted by Minnesota. Only 1 million people watched it, and then they took on Maryland. About the same amount of people watched that. Of course, the high water marks, again, are going to be against Ohio State and Michigan. 4.5 million people watched Ohio State and Michigan State, even though that was a lousy game that they lost by 29 points. It wasn't that close. The Michigan game was more of a slugfest back and forth in regards to a slow plotting game that Michigan controlled. Finally won 29-7. It was close at halftime. 5.5 million people watched it. And then down the stretch, nobody was watching Michigan State until they showed up against Penn State in the final game of the season. This was the most watched game on FS1 the entire season, Michigan State, Penn State. All told, the Spartans on the Big Ten Network 5 times, ABC 3 times, Fox once, FS1 twice, and once on ESPN. That was the opener against Western Michigan. More people watched Indiana football in 2022, even though the Hoosiers were bad again, than watched their old Oak and Bucket rival, Purdue, the Big Ten Western Division champion, a far superior Illinois team that went 8-5, and also a 9-4 Minnesota team. Why do you think? I think we know why. Indiana plays in the same division with Ohio State, Michigan, Michigan State, and Penn State. All right, so look at the non-conference action. Nobody watched Western Kentucky. Ouch, 166,000 people. At Cincinnati on ESPN2, almost 500,000 watched that game. Then they dive into conference play after the Illinois game in week 1, back into conference play against Nebraska. Look at the Michigan game. 4 million people watched Indiana and Michigan. Later in the season, 3.34 million people watched Indiana and Ohio State. 2.2 million watched Indiana and Penn State. Those are the 3 high-water mark games for Indiana football. Not necessarily the best games, but against the best teams. And those games were broadcast by Fox twice and ABC. All told, Indiana showed up in the Big Ten Network 6 times. ABC once against Penn State, Fox twice, Ohio State, Michigan, ESPN2 twice, and FS1 once. 14.2 14.2 million people watched Indiana football in 12 regular season games. Now let's get to the heavy hitters. Penn State, are you up to the challenge? Well, we will see on the field in 2023. How about in the TV ratings in 22? There you see the Purdue game we talked about on Fox with only one game of competition. Even people watch Penn State and Ohio on ABC, 1.5 million people at noon. The Auburn game, only appearance by a Big Ten team on CBS the entire season. Over 4 million people watched it. That was the #1 game of the week. Nobody watched Central Michigan, of course, 628,000 on the Big Ten Network. Then you've got Northwestern, Michigan. Look at that number. Penn State at Michigan, 6.5 million viewers. Then against Minnesota, 3.5 million. That was ABC primetime. Ohio State, wow. Great game, down to the wire, fourth quarter game. 8.5 million people watched Penn State and Ohio State. Penn State showed up on the Big Ten Network twice, ABC 4 times, Fox 4 times, CBS, and FS1. And again, that was the highest rated game on FS1 the entire season against Michigan State. 36.5 million people watched Penn State football. Tack on the Rose Bowl game against Utah, the highest rated bowl game that was not a playoff game, as usual for the Rose Bowl in 2022. Did more people watch Ohio State football than anyone else in the Big Ten? Did more people watch Ohio State football in 2022 than any team in the nation? Right out of the gate, 10.5 million people watched Ohio State Notre Dame on ABC. Then 2 weeks later, even against Toledo on Fox, 3+ million people watched it. That would be like a highly rated Pac-12 game. A lot of views all over the place for Ohio State. Not much we can go through there, just to let the numbers speak for themselves and put it into context. And we will hear in just a second when we look at the Buckeyes and the Wolverines on TV. The Michigan State game, the Iowa game, over 4 million. Ton of people watched the Penn State game, even the Northwestern game that was highly competitive into the second half. The Indiana game was awful. Ohio State blew them out easily, but still 3.3 million people watched the game. And then down the stretch, the Maryland game, intriguing fourth quarter game on ABC, 6.6 million, one of the highest rated games of the season. Then, of course, the game and the ridiculous number of 17.1 million. So all told, 12 regular season games for Ohio State. 69.6 million people watched the Buckeyes in 12 games. 92 million people watched Ohio State when we include the playoff game. Shoot, if Ohio State would have played in a Big Ten championship game and a college football national championship game, shoot, they would have gotten, what, 125 million views. All told, let's look at the network distribution, and this tells you a whole lot here, too. They're not messing around on FS1 or on ESPN2, not even on ESPN, the entire Ohio State schedule. So they've got to play on the Big Ten Network, I think contractually, for one non-conference game and one conference game. So 2 on BTN, but the other 5 on ABC, 5 on Fox. That's going to look familiar here in just a second. Let's look at Michigan. This is pretty astonishing. This was one of the most watched games of week 1. Michigan and Colorado State on ABC at noon. Almost 4 million people watched it. Then they took a week off against Hawaii, Big Ten Network. Still 500,000 people watched it. And you got to consider all the games on the Big Ten Network that are much more digestible than that game, and less people watched them. And then Michigan, UConn, still 2 million people watched the Huskies and the Wolverines. Now into conference play, and again, people are showing up every week. The Maryland game, the Iowa game, Indiana, all over 4 million. Penn State, 6.5 million. Michigan State, Rutgers, we've seen all these numbers when we went down the other teams. Everybody's watching Michigan football every week. And then the game is a spectacle, and it is the greatest rivalry in college football. Well, let's add it all up. Did you do that? Did you do Ohio State and Michigan in your head? Well, here it is for you, 58.87. So about 11 million less than the Ohio State schedule. We'll get to that in just a second. Tack on the playoff game against TCU at 21.7, about 700,000 less viewers than the Peach Bowl game, Ohio State and Georgia. 80.5 million watched Michigan play. And look at this. Same distribution of networks as Ohio State, because basically the pecking order is the same. The networks have to go through the same process in selecting these games. Who do they want to take? Well, they want to take Ohio State and Michigan. So whoever has the better opponent is going to get the selection. So again, the Big Ten Network gets a certain selection as mandated by the conference, so they get Michigan twice. Once non-conference, once conference. So check out the unique dynamic that we have in matching up Ohio State and Michigan in 2022. Yes, all told, Michigan turned out to be the better team. They won the game on the field. They won the Big Ten championship, so forth and so on. But think about it from a TV rating standpoint. They played each other, of course. Then they played 6 common opponents. So 7 of the 12 games that they played, you can match up directly and see who was more popular. In addition to that, they had the same season. So it's not like we're matching up Ohio State 2019 as a much better team than Michigan. It's not like one of the 2 teams was much better. And when it was decided, so Michigan fans, if you're going to claim that Michigan was much better, that's fine. I have no issue with that. But by the time that was decided, that was the last game of the season. So up until then, they were both 11-0 going into the game when it was decided Michigan was 3 scores better. So in terms of popularity, this is a fair judgment to make this particular season, and probably the only one we've seen like it since maybe 2006. Ohio State had the one enormous non-conference game against Notre Dame. Michigan didn't play anyone, so they didn't have that kind of game. I guess we could also liken it to Ohio State taking on Toledo on Fox with 3 million viewers, and the Michigan-Colorado State game at almost 4 million viewers, but the UConn game at 2 million. So that pretty much evens out as well. All right, but when they played like teams, like circumstances, and like networks, well, what happened there? They both played Iowa, and Ohio State had slightly more views, and they both played on Fox, and they both played at noon. That was the only matchup that they shared in the Big Ten Western Division. When we look at teams within the division, okay, they both took on Michigan State, of course, and Michigan had more viewers in that rivalry game against Michigan State, but it was ABC in prime time. For Ohio State, Michigan State, it was ABC, it was at noon, and the Michigan State game was closer in terms of closer throughout the game. Ohio State blew out Michigan State pretty quickly, but more people watched Michigan State by about 1.1 million. How about the Penn State game? Well, similar circumstances here. Fox at noon for both games. Michigan-Penn State, 6.45 million. Now, Michigan blew them out eventually, but it was a Penn State lead early in the third quarter. Now, the Ohio State-Penn State game was much more competitive until about 9 or 10 minutes left, so there's that. But a ton more people watched Ohio State and Penn State play at the same time slot on the same network. They both played Maryland, of course. The Michigan game was on Fox, 4.38 million. Look at the Maryland-Ohio State game, 6.6 million. And now both of these games were competitive down to the wire. But Ohio State-Maryland was just a great game, and a ton of people watched that game. When we look at the matchup against Indiana, we see that the Michigan matchup against Indiana on Fox drew a little bit more people, 4 million compared to 3.3 million. Same circumstances, Ohio State and Indiana on Fox. And then finally, the direct comparison of both teams taking on Rutgers in the Big Ten Network. When Ohio State took on the Scarlet Knights, 1.8 million viewers. For Michigan and Rutgers, it was 1.29. So it was the highest rated game in the Big Ten Network, Ohio State-Rutgers. Michigan-Rutgers, I believe, was the 3rd, maybe the 4th highest rated game on BTN all season. So when you add it all up, I think you got to go with Ohio State as a slight edge over Michigan, but it's difficult to tell. But I think the numbers stack up in the Buckeyes range when you look at popularity on TV to a certain extent. Again, 11 million more people watched Ohio State games. They did have the Notre Dame game, but Michigan had more favorable matchups in the Big Ten Western Division. And when you look at the 6 common opponents, Ohio State fared a little bit better. Interesting to note here as we look at the rankings in the Big Ten 1 through 14 that, again, Purdue won the Big Ten West, but nobody was watching the games up until they caught them in Indianapolis, and then the demolition that they had to endure against LSU 63-7. There you see the various teams in the Big Ten. And, of course, this is going to fluctuate as teams get better and worse. Bring in USC and UCLA. It's going to be intriguing to see their impact and how they fare against the football-hardened viewers there in the Midwest. Your thoughts below. Leave your comments on this. And if we get the feedback that we like, if we get the feedback that we need to continue the series, we will, right here at the Voice of College Football.